Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this week-long symposium, part of the Adirondacks for All Identity and Environmental Justice series. This series has been jointly presented by the Adirondack Experience, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the Wild Center, and the Nature Conservancy. This past summer, the Adirondacks for All program series opened space for dialogue around topics including historical preservation, social justice, climate change, and environmental policy. The symposium will feature 3 roundtable discussions that build on those conversations and provide further opportunity for public engagement with critical issues that have relevance well beyond the Adirondacks themselves. Project collaborators approach the Adirondacks for All initiative as a long-term endeavor to work towards a more inclusive, accessible, and protected Adirondack Park. The symposium begins this evening with a critical exploration of the Adirondack past. Within the last few decades, individuals and organizations across the Adirondacks have increasingly challenged the cultural, social, and political assumptions at the foundation of Euro-Centric historical narratives. And we are very pleased to invite 3 speakers this evening whose work has contributed to this evolution in historical thinking. My name is Eric Reardon. I'm the project director, and I would like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki people. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and lifeways. This roundtable discussion, entitled Reframing Adirondack History, features a conversation between Darren Bonaparte, Amy Godine, and Paul Miller. Paul A. Miller is an independent writer, photographer, and filmmaker based in upstate New York. As an experienced television professional, he worked for national shows and networks including the History Channel, National Geographic Channel, PBS, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. In his feature-length documentary, Searching for Timbuktu, he seeks to add some much-needed dimension to the well-known story of John Brown and his Harper Ferry raid, by revealing how a little-known Black settlement in the Adirondacks helped lay a path towards the Civil War and, as a result, changed the course of American history. Amy Godine, an independent scholar and longtime Adirondack Life contributor, has been writing and lecturing about Adirondack social history since 1989. Her interest has been Black and ethnic history, migratory Adirondackers, and other non-elites whose regional experience is often unacknowledged in the historical record. Exhibitions she has written or curated on ethnic diversity in the region have appeared in the Chapman Museum, the Saratoga History Museum, and the Adirondack Museum. Her exhibition, Dreaming of Timbuktu, the story of an abolitionist-founded Black farm settlement in North Elba, is at the John Brown Farm Historic Site in Lake Placid. Next fall, Cornell University Press will bring out her new book, The Black Woods, a comprehensive history of this pioneering civil rights initiative before the Civil War. Darren Bonaparte is a cultural historian from the Akwesasne First Nation. He is a frequent lecturer at schools, universities, museums, and historical sites in the United States and Canada. Darren has written 3 books, several articles, and the libretto for the McGill Chamber Orchestra's Aboriginal Visions and Voices. He currently serves as the director of the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe. Throughout this evening's presentation, I would invite everyone to please feel free to submit any questions they may have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to start this discussion by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and share their interest in work in history as it relates to the Adirondacks and beyond. Darren, would you mind going first?
Oh, no, I don't mind going first. Well, I've seen the Adirondacks just about every single day of my life. Looking south from Akwesasne on the St. Lawrence River, you know, we can see the northern Adirondacks, and they're just little faint purple bumps most of the time. But when we venture into it, it's like going to Mordor or someplace. It's a place of where your imagination just bursts, because this was our ancient hunting grounds, and it was sometimes a battleground. At times even a no man's land, and but most of the time it was a place for sustenance. And so as a community historian, it's kind of it takes on a different role at different periods. So I'm trying to plunge more into looking at history from a geographical standpoint, and the Adirondacks play such an enormous role in my people's history that it's almost like the centerpiece of our history. So in a nutshell, that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks so much, Darren. Could I ask Amy Godin, would you go next to introduce yourself?
Sure. I don't have Darren's very personal, immediate connection to the region. Mine is really more opportunistic. I discovered the Adirondacks through Adirondack Life magazine, which was the only venue I could find when I moved to the region in 1988 that might publish feature articles. And as far as I could tell, nothing in that magazine had anything to do with social history at that time. It was all about boats, great camps, amazing hikes, and terrific views. And this wasn't my wheelhouse, but I did know how to discover and research stories of social history. So that's what I found the vacuum and I occupied it. And that became very exciting over time. Initially, it was just articles about various ethnic groups who'd never been recognized in the pages of any book or magazine that I could see, whether they were Jewish peddlers or French Canadian farmers or Irish rivermen or Italian road workers or Polish miners. The list was infinite, it seemed to me. But at a certain point, my interest shifted to move into how these non-elite groups were perceived by the dominant culture, by most Adirondackers of Anglo descent, Anglophone speakers, and how they were represented in history. And that got me into the crosshairs of racialization and that process, and how people are represented on the page by Main Street historians at the time that they arrived and after. And that was very interesting. That was more interesting to me. And that took me deep into the culture wars of the late 19th century and beyond. And that led to the exhibit that I worked on, and now the book, about the story of the Black settlers who came to Franklin and Essex County in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s in order to farm and in order to vote, because if they owned land to the amount of $250 in value, they could gain the vote in New York, a racialized vote that wasn't changed until 1870. And that was a pretty thrilling entry into that story, and got me thinking harder and deeper about historiography and the role that history plays in shaping our perception of not just who lives here, but how to think about them and what the Adirondack means, who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that is a very compelling question for this talk too, I think. That's where I am.
Thanks so much, Amy. And Paul, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your work, please.
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Eric, for having me on this panel. It's an honor to be here. So thank you. I come to the Adirondacks and this by way of marriage, frankly. I'm from Chicago, but my wife is a native New Yorker from Central New York, and that's how I ended up here. I live in Albany, and in pursuing my master's degree in history and media, my master's thesis film, I had to produce a master's thesis film, and that's when I discovered the great work of Amy Godin. And she just so eloquently spoke about her work, and were it not for what she's done and kept and uncovered the story and kept it alive I would not have a film. So I'm eternally grateful for Amy for giving me the platform and allowing me to stand on her shoulders to create this film, and which is about what she spoke about. It's important to know, for most people, like if you've come up to Lake Placid and you drive by John Brown's farmhouse, very few people stop to ask why that's there. And the fact of the matter is, it's there because of those black settlers. They came first, then John Brown came. So that's how I came to this topic. And the Adirondacks is a great love. My family loves to go camping there and winter there when we can. So it's a great joy as a person who's not from New York to be able to discover not only the gem of the Adirondacks, but the history of New York, which is just so rich and deep and significant in America's story.
Thank you so much, Paul. The first question I wanted to pose to the group to get the conversation started is, the title of this panel is Reframing Adirondack History. So I wonder how each of you would define the pursuit of reframing history. And I think particularly in the moment that we exist in right now, where we're witnessing sort of the resurgence of the culture wars reflected in history and education, reflected in other arenas. What would this reframing entail for the Adirondacks, do you think? And feel free, anyone who wants to jump in and get that started.
Well, I can start. I think frames wear out when the story gets too big for them. And if they don't stay very flexible and malleable, they break. And in the Adirondacks, we've seen such an explosion of new scholarship, new artistic work, new cultural interest, and general interest in stories that have never been told before. I would say in the last 25 years, this has been a big move that Adirondack, the main frame of Adirondack history, which is the environmental story, in my opinion, it's the story of the emergence of the Adirondack Park, the preservation of the wilderness, the creating this marvelous Central Park for the world of 6 million acres. That's the dominant narrative. And if the frame is going to change, it has to address that narrative and see how that narrative has advanced or repressed these other stories and how it can accommodate them and work with them and be provoked into changing, perhaps, and becoming a little more inclusive than it has been, to bring in these stories and not just use them as sort of, how can I put it, cloves in a ham that stick in and give it flavor, but something more integrated and essential to the understanding of the region. And so the first object inside the frame is the park story, or rather the wilderness discourse, the conservation discourse. So that's what we're looking at in a way when we talk about reframing the picture.
Yeah, I'd probably second that. I think when you originally posed the question about reframing, it carries with it this notion of almost like recentering, but what I prefer, but that also carries with it some exclusionary sort of undertones, that if we're going to recenter that, we're not focusing on something else. But I kind of like to think of it as expanding the frame so that we have more of a complete picture, a more accurate picture, because if you look through a camera lens and you take a photo, you're only seeing what's inside those borders, just like we're looking at these zoom frames right now, and we're only seeing what's inside these 4 borders, but we're not getting the complete view of my basement here, which has a ton of kids' toys behind me. So without expanding the frame, we don't have the proper context in which to really judge what's accurate, what is inaccurate, who was left out, and where the focus, or if there should be a focus on any one thing. I think we need to expand the frame so that people can decide for themselves what is meaningful to them.
Okay, I guess that pause means I'm delayed in jumping in. my whole thing is that when we're reframing or repositioning ourselves to look at a subject like this, and I think about how the Adirondacks, which was, as you said in the introduction, Eric, about it's in the land acknowledgement, you mentioned that it's the territory of the Abenaki and the Mohawk. Just that statement alone calls into the two different perspectives of history that the Abenaki people and the Mohicans also, the Algonquian neighbors of the Iroquois. We had different but similar cultures, and we were both on the edges of the Adirondacks, because most of the time indigenous people are staying close to waterways, close to flatlands where they can plant, and the more rugged terrain becomes a hunting ground. And so since we're all kind of like the numbers around a clock, basically, when it comes to the Adirondacks, it does have that circular land formation thing. And then the waterways that are around the Adirondacks were all dominated by different groups. And when you look at the pageantry of history over the last 4 centuries or so, you see how maybe it wasn't stated in all of the European accounts of that time period, but it really was a kind of focal point for these different tribes, because we had a little piece of that pie. I'm going to use food metaphors because Amy's ham metaphor was so spot on. So I guess it's going to be a food metaphor night. But yeah, so when you think about the Adirondacks as being a big pie and different tribes having a slice of that pie, and the Mohawks having that really choice southern bottom part, and then ends up kind of taking over the whole pie after a while. And then because of the same factors that made us dominant, we end up losing that pie to others.
Mm.
And it just becomes, a dessert that we remember long ago.
Mm.
And so in my research and having to confront those centuries of conflict and movement and migration and radical culture change, the Adirondacks take on that extra dimension as, I hate to use movie analogies, but it does have that kind of lost world aspect to the indigenous people today, that when we wander back on, following the regular roads everybody else does and visiting, doing the hikes and playing the tourist game, we're haunted by the memory of all that territory meant for us. There were so many battles that took place. It's just so rich with the past that it's a haunting place for us when we go up and try to enjoy the Adirondacks. Like, even when I went up and did the zip line about 3 weeks ago at Lake Placid, I still had that kind of mystical feeling about it, knowing that that at one time this was such a heated emotional place where empires lost, where just so much drama took place that it kind of staggers me. And to anybody else, you're just leaf peeping, you're driving around, oohing and eyeing, and looking for a bear to cross the road. But for me, I'm just flooded with all of this colonial stuff that happened there. So yeah, I think about it all the time. It's almost like I have this visual map in my mind all the time. It's like a chess piece, a chessboard or something. in my consciousness. And it's all about the waterways around the Adirondacks, the ones going through it, coming down, that played such a pivotal part that usually gets left out of the historical narratives because they're just not seeing that the way we did. So yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to focus my mind on that right now.
All fantastic responses. And Paul, please jump in while I maybe consider a follow-up.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, I wanted to ask Darren, and we've talked about this in a previous meeting, and he mentioned the land acknowledgement, and he just spoke so eloquently about the, how in some ways being kind of haunted by these not memories, but about what you know about the land and your people who came and before. My question is, I work at a university where we too also issue a land acknowledgement, and I think that it's a great first step. I'm wondering if those types of things also for you, I hate to use the word trigger, but also kind of also in some ways, is that it does it bring up these memories even more? Does it make it even more present? Is it a net benefit or?
Well, yeah, actually, when I get contacted about these land acknowledgements fairly often from universities mostly, and it actually does. It opens up that can of worms of whose land at what time are you talking about, which I always tell people. I said it's very, very complicated, and I actually kind of push them away from specifically identifying a nation. And I always tell people, I say, we've been doing a land acknowledgement all the time. We call it Ahonda Galiwa Degwa, which is where when we do a big public event, and it started with the ceremonies that people did in the Longhouse. They would say this opening prayer before every ceremony. Then they start doing it all over the place all the time. But it really is a kind of not just land, but all the living life and creation, and even up into the stars. You start from the ground and work your way up, acknowledging all the elements. And so it connects you, it connects everybody that's present. So that's my tendency, is to tell people, like these land acknowledgements are a foreign construct, even with the best intentions, because it places ownership in one nation,
Right.
whereas our true concept is never would even conceive of ownership. It's of us playing a small part in a greater whole of all of that creation. We're not above it. We don't own it. We're a part of it. We're lucky to be a part of it. And so that's what I try to get people when they email these statements. And sometimes it's a statement about their own personal politics. I got an email, I was part of an email chain about land acknowledgements that was just so much hand wringing about the traumas of colonization. It was like a laundry list of all the worst things that have happened. And when it was done, I'm like, that's not a land acknowledgement. My God, that's a screenplay. I don't want to watch that movie. And so
Yeah.
I just shied away from that. I said, I almost think it's not worth my time to argue with these people, because the statement is more about them than it sure is about us. And so that's what I try to repicture it and tell people, if you're going to do something that is kind of honorary to the natives, well, look at what we do when we start an event. Is we kind of bring everybody back to that human level, part of nature, part of a big system, and get them thinking like that. And this whole thing of who owned what when, like that's been my last 30 years, is trying to sort that stuff out. You're not going to sort it out in 10 minutes before a football game.
I'm gonna I have something that occurs to me while you talk, and that is that the greater gift, it seems to me, of the Native American experience for the idea of reframing the Adirondacks is the idea is the culture of understanding the land in terms of usage, not ownership, which is the idea of the Adirondack Park. It's the idea of promoting a place that can be used, enjoyed, savored, remembered. And the first precedent for that I'm aware of, there have been several, is the culture of indigenous peoples who had that ideal in mind. And that to me is the stress worth honoring and exploring historically and bringing into use for the Adirondack Park and the Adirondack Museum, for that matter. That's a wonderful backstory that foretells what will happen down the pike, at least in the halls of the Adirondack experience and elsewhere, and in the trails of the park. And there are other stories in the Adirondacks that make that point and show that kind of approach to the Adirondacks too. There are the early pioneers who enjoyed the land in common and used it as a commons for hunting and trapping, and were completely spurned by the conservation discourse when that emerged. But they too show the way as far as how to understand the land in terms of something to be used, not something to be owned. That ideas of titles, deeds, ownership, and the accumulation of wealth was not necessarily the only way to approach nature. And what marvelous precedents there are there. And those Smith grantees, as far as that goes, as far as they came up, as they came to the region in order to gain access to the vote, shared a common goal, a common approach to the land, which understood land in terms of civic empowerment and civic gains and civic power. And that too was another way to think about the land. And these are all in the Adirondack past. They're all in what we know about the region, but we haven't harnessed them and put them to use to show another model for enjoying the region as much as we could.
And it occurs to me as I'm hearing this conversation that each of you are invested in this work of recentering, reframing, reinterpreting, but that work can be often fraught with controversy, as we're kind of seeing today that play out with, really difficult discussions around, critical race theory or the way history is taught in schools. And so, I wonder whether, our panelists could speak to why is it that this work of reframing, recentering, reinterpreting, bringing in the experience of these non-elite groups, as Amy described, why is that so fraught with controversy? And, how can we best expand the lens, as Paul mentioned, expand that portrait to include underrepresented groups, in a way that, ideally invites people into the conversation and the dialogue and doesn't alienate them? It's a loaded question, but.
I mean, one of the problems with the word diversity, which Clarence Thomas expressed frustration with the other day, I read, is that it is such a code word that means different things to different cohorts. And I think it needs to be revisited and as an academic might say, reinterrogated. It's not my language, but it worked right then. And I think the way to make it a more engaging idea for Adirondackers in particular is to make it more inclusive of the people in the Adirondack region. So it isn't sort of shorthand for the Black experience, which I've seen it constrained by, and I don't think that's inclusive enough. I think that there are ways to bring the idea of diversity to bear on how we look at non-elites and what was left out of the record and out of the environmental story especially, that would show great commonality between different groups. And it would defy a kind of exceptionalist idea of Adirondack history that I don't think always has done the park a mess of good. So that's one rather conservative response to your provocative question. I'm not going with it where you probably hoped, but my interest right now is with the history of poor Adirondack farmers, white farmers, who were completely kind of demonized in the early writings of environmentalists, conservationists, who picture them as despoilers, wreckers, poachers, thieves, bad sports, bad players in the conservation story, who wrecked the view, whose farms were messy and untidy, who were too poor for the prospects of this new Central Park for the world, and had to kind of be scrubbed from the viewfinder because they were in the way. And they lasted a lot longer than Adirondack histories give them credit for. And they didn't do well. It was a languishing, struggling economy and culture, but they hung in there. And that's a category of Adirondack, or a world and a heritage that has been little recognized, I think, in our halls of culture. I'd love to see more attention paid to farming, to subsistence farming in particular, especially in light of the recent boom in Adirondack small-scale community-supported farms. I mean, there's a actual, it's amazing what's going on, especially in Eastern Essex County right now. And let's see, what are the numbers I have? They're impressive. 506 farmers in the Adirondack region, 150 of them women. Talk about diversity. Talk about diversity. When did that happen? That's a recent boomlet. That's worth connecting to what happened in the past, and following that thread and tracing it. And that would span all manner of cultures, including indigenous farmers who are still at it and have been at it from the very beginning. It's just a thought.
I mean, I'll take the bait a little bit. I think that these are sometimes fraught when you try to reframe or recenter or expand the frame, whatever term you want to use, that what it does is it threatens the dominant narrative, right? You're in the business of myth busting at that point, right? So when you're in the business of myth busting, you are saying, I'm not only upsetting the apple cart, I'm challenging whether it's even apples in the cart. So I think about, like, there's a point in my film where a mid-19th century newspaper person was writing about these black settlers and said, this is the ideal, this is the place where Garrett Smith thinks that Negroes can make a way for themselves in the Adirondack wilds. And he says, like, a Nantucket Yankee might possibly do it, but a Negro unused to independence could never. So when you start telling the story, like, well, no, there are people there who are doing it, it kind of, it shakes the ground underneath that narrative, right? And you see this played out in a lot of different ways. I mean, I only recently just discovered this book called Blackjacks, and it's African-American seamen in the age of sail, right?
Good book.
So, yeah, it kind of upsets the notion that, Blacks' seafaring experience was limited to the Middle Passage, right? Which is untrue. But if you don't tell these stories, if you don't expand it so that people get a more complete picture, then all that's left is the dominant narrative, which there's a lot of people who have made, who have constructed institutions upon, which then have to be unwound. So I think that's why it gets politically fraught, and we see that play out in our, in our contemporary lives right now. And so, but I think that's why we have to be in the business of showing a more complete picture, so that better decisions can be made, better stories can be told.
Darren, if you'll quickly permit me to set that in a context for you that occurred during our last program series. We featured a program about, deep indigenous heritage of the Adirondacks. And there are still people today who believe that indigenous people never really lived in the Adirondacks. They were just passing through. It was too cold. It was too inhospitable. And it seems to me that this effort to kind of delegitimize or discount the deep indigenous presence in the Adirondacks region is still ongoing. So never mind upsetting people, people will just outright reject attempts to recenter, reframe, dig deeper into these historical legacies. So I wonder, related to that question, but this is something that we encountered in the program series from this last summer.
Well, in a sense, there's a certain element to truth that because of the cold climate, that you don't see huge village sites like you do in the lower lands, and that we would kind of allocate this kind of a terrain for seasonal hunting. And so yeah, there is a little bit of truth to that, but it definitely wasn't like that we were almost like strangers to it. That's ridiculous, because we knew all the waterways, and we knew that anybody who controlled basically this circular mountain range where all the rivers go east, west, north, south, anybody who controlled that range of mountains pretty much dominated the whole region, because you're going, if you control the mountains and the rivers going downward, then you have access to a vast range of land. And so that's why it was kind of an important, like a hot spot for people. And so it's just that bias that scholars have about equating cultural importance to larger and larger settlements, when, you know what I mean, like they just have this a village to city equates civilization and value in their minds, whereas to us, the not using it all the time has more value to it. You know what I mean? Like when you have a seasonal hunting ground that you go in and certain times of the year, that's where you want to be for certain kinds of game, and especially when it comes to hunting and fishing and trapping and spearing fish and knowing all the spawning stuff. So the value of it for an actual people isn't in actually inhabiting it all the time. So that's why I think we need to look carefully at some of those arguments, because I think they really miss a point there.
Here again, it seems like the indigenous heritage sets a template for understanding how to be more inclusive in our understanding of the Adirondacks today, where seasonal usage is so essential to the health and welfare and existence of the Adirondack Park. And
Yep.
'Twas ever thus, if you look back, and to delegitimize that because of non-ownership is completely out of step with the values of the park and the sharing of the wilderness, which is blind to caste, blind to race, and blind to class in every respect, or ought to be. And so this is another way I think indigenous cultures sets a model or can be referenced really profitably. I just heard last week someone giving a talk on Adirondack agriculture who dispensed with native use of the woods in a sentence. They weren't here very long. It was only occasional. And so it really doesn't count. They weren't farmers, which blew my mind to be hearing this in 2022. And this was an expert on Adirondack farming. So yeah, we got a ways to go before correcting this very deeply invested in mythology. It's treacherous and it's antiquated. It's time to let it die.
If you don't mind me jumping in, people are missing another story. I was at an event a couple years back in Canton, New York, where it was a panel, a group of different people speaking, and one author got up and he was giving the true crime aspect of the Adirondacks. And he talked about all these little back road meth labs. And he says, that's the story Adirondack life won't touch with a 10-foot pole. He says
Huh.
that nobody wants to hear that, bring attention to that, because that nobody wants to go in camping in an area where they might stumble upon some tin shack loaded with chemicals
Yeah.
and get shot. And so he says, but this is the untold story of the Adirondacks today, is that all over the place, there's dirt poor people and they're running these little operations. And he says, nobody wants to talk about it. He says, because everybody still wants this big emerald forest for tourism. It goes against that narrative. And so I'm like, well, geez, now you know how we feel of always being left out of the story.
Mhm.
But he had a point there that, the Adirondacks isn't just about ski centers and cute little shops with stuffed teddy bears. It's also got that human aspect of poor people. And, the whole tourism industry just comes to a screeching halt in the fall. I just drove right through the Adirondacks 2 weeks ago to go speak in the Mohawk Valley, and everything was shut down. I was like, where do people go for lunch? Every single place along the way was closed. I thought it's so depressing, So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Mhm. Mhm.
And a common theme I'm hearing here that kind of leads me to my next question is that it seems, based on the conversation I'm hearing, is that we would agree that history does influence the way we relate to the land, the water, the mountains, the wildlife, the people, the communities across the Adirondack region. So I wonder if folks would like to give some examples from their own work and the way in which they think history is still present with us today in the way different groups or communities interact with the natural landscape.
So I can start off with this one. Just in terms of my film, one of the narrators of my film is Dr. Alice Green. If you don't know who Dr. Green is, she's a well-known social justice, civil rights activist here in Albany, but she grew up in the Adirondacks. And now I'm trying to remember which town. I want to say Witherby.
Witherby.
Witherby. Okay, I got
Yeah.
it. But she said before she had, she obviously knew of Amy's work, but growing up, she didn't know as a person of color living in the Adirondacks that there were other Black people who had been there before her. So if we don't cover those types of stories, then people assume, or they're told a different narrative that Black people weren't ever in the Adirondacks before, name your date. They grow up with that narrative, and they have to then, if they're lucky enough, unlearn it by discovering the work of Amy or Darren, and discover like, oh, there's a whole new narrative. And so, yeah, history plays a huge part in how people utilize the resources like the Adirondack Park, because if they don't see themselves represented in the history or in present day, then they're probably unlikely to feel connected to it and use it. So
Mhm. It's interesting. I remember talking to a historian, a town historian, one of the best in the Adirondack Park, who wrote a memorable history of North Elba and Lake Placid, which is the first history I'm aware of ever to address the story of the Smith grantees and to do research on each of them. And this is just in North Elba, mind you. And I asked her once why she didn't press beyond the borders of North Elba to investigate as well the Black settlers who came up from the city and elsewhere and from the deep south to farm in Franklin County, just beyond just beyond St. Armand in Franklin itself. And she was appalled. She said, that's out of my bailiwick. That's someone else's territory. I do not cross the line. I'm busy enough with my own fiefdom right here, and I don't stray. And she was like guarding the gates and also defending the right of another historian to do her work or his work, which never happened. And that kind of hyper boosterism and provincialism has done history no favors. On one hand, you can go very deep in one town and there's nothing there in the next one. And it leaves all of us who are trying to develop a more synthetic, comprehensive history scrambling after primary sources and documents to fill in these gaps and correct mistakes too. And it's a lot of work going to the heart of this to find the truly diverse history of the region, which is really not represented in county histories or in town histories. For the most part, you have to go into very primary sources to get this stuff up. And it's worth the chase, but it's a travail. It's tough. It's a lot of work. That's all.
I encounter a little bit of lately there's been some backlash to doing archival and documentary research. The Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois, have been studied by scholars and written about. We have the most literature than any indigenous group. I know, because it's practically destroying the floors of my house. I have so many books. They're gonna wreck my house. And so there's a huge literature, and I encourage more and more people to plunge into it. But there's also a political movement among our people where I call it radicalization, and they've kind of seized upon our traditional culture and saying, because that wasn't originally in an oral tradition, there you learn everything from an elder generation to generation, that we don't need to read anything in the white man's history books. And so to me, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that kind of, and I almost like call it Trumpism. It's the Indian version of Trumpism, is that we're going to roll back the clock to some golden mythical time, And so as an intellectual person who tries to be intellectual, I'm just flabbergasted that that way of thinking. And it comes out, it really was pronounced when the residential school situation became very widely known about the discovery of potential graves, unmarked graves. And then the Pope came to visit a few months ago, came to Canada, and on social media, that just provoked this torrent of derision, not only towards the Catholic Church, but to the European powers that colonized us, to the elected officials that we have in our communities, and to the Catholic natives. We all got thrown under that big unstoppable bus in this reaction to this thing. So it really polarized the discussion in Indian country, that it kind of like certain people would basically draw a line in the sand and say, you're on our side or you're on that side. And I just couldn't fathom that. That just is so, it's certainly not the way our ancestors looked at,
To jump from that to something that Paul said, I feel the same way about, I, like Paul, I think, recoil from the word recenter in this discussion, or it's too strong for what I think of when I think of reframing and expanding the scope of Adirondack history. I would like to see it include not just the environmental discourse, but the stories of peoples who worked with and were not valued so much by that discourse, and make that part of the story. I'd like to see it challenge itself. And it's now so entrenched and so stable and so much a part of our culture. I think the great fight for the park is behind us, but it's a moment for reflection and for being even self-critical and more open to another way of understanding what it means to be for the Adirondack wilderness. It means as well to be for Adirondack farmers. It means to be for poor pioneers in search of the right to vote. It means to be for these diverse communities who are being recognized all around the park or in need of recognition. There's room in it for everybody. And there's certainly room to acknowledge that it isn't complete, that there's much more to be told than the stories of the architects of the park. So that's where what you said, Paul, really resonated with me. I recoil from people who think I'm saying, let's back off on the park. Let's give up on that blue line. I'm not on board with that at all. I just say, let's spread the wealth inside it a little more.
This is an amazing conversation that could continue for easily another hour. Before we turn to audience Q&A, I wonder if each of you could mention, is there a work of Adirondack history that has been particularly impactful for you? What do you point to as an example of history as either something that we can emulate and build upon, or something that has contributed to some of those myths that need to be re-examined, perhaps?
Oh, you gotta let me start on this one. I'm just gonna say everything Amy's ever written,
Oh, come
something that
on.
we can point to. Because that's where all of my sort of work has come from. So
Oh, well, that's
I'll
very
start there.
sweet. Thank you, Paul. But there's other folks out there too who are doing amazing work. I think we are all worried about and enamored of, but concerned by the abiding influence of Donaldson's 2-volume biography, history of the Adirondack Park, which has exerted such a long, pernicious influence on how we see Black people in the park, but also minorities generally, and people who aren't part of his world. And that kind of exclusionary take on who belongs here has really done more damage than good. At the same time, he's great reading. So to find Adirondack historians who write that well and hew to a wider vision of the history is the challenge. I love William Chapman White, but Adirondack country, but his book too has its narrow focus and discounts the importance of migratory laborers and immigrants in the industrial sector and doesn't give them the time of day. And oh golly, there are essays in Paul Jameson's anthology on the Adirondacks, which are beautiful, but again, it's a kind of essentially triumphalist vision of the Adirondack Park that prevails in that. And there are more critical books out now. I'm really keen on the book Crimes Against Nature by Carl Jacobi, who has a wonderful chapter. It's not all about the Adirondacks, but he has a chapter on the so-called defilers of the wilderness, the working class rural folk whose culture ran against and failed really in their struggle to hold their ground against the conservationist lobby and enforcers. And it's a marvelously sympathetic portrait. You're nodding because you know the book, Eric, huh? Yeah.
It's a great book for all the
Yeah.
reasons you just described.
Yeah. And I learned an awful lot from a biography of Melville Dewey. It wasn't easy reading. It wasn't pleasant reading, but it was incredibly informative about exclusionary social culture in the Adirondack Park and how much of it was about keeping people out as bringing people in, and how that has to be reckoned when we think about the meaning of conservation today. But I can't remember the title of the book, so oh well. And of course, the work of Phil Terry is very important for understanding rural culture and how it divided and it was stressed and split by the emergence of recreation and park and the development of the park in the first place, and what happened to the rural people of the park when the conservationists gained the upper hand. And we're glad they did, but it portended badly for many people who could not afford those pleasures. So that's going on too long. Someone else take the reins right now.
I want to recommend a book, Rural Indigenousness by
Oh, yeah.
Melissa Otis.
Great book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that book, especially because it kind of focuses on the Faddens and the Onchayota Museum, the Iroquois Six Nations Museum there, and also talks about my fellow Abenaki Indigenous people and their use of the Adirondacks. You know, it gives a real detailed account of the fact that, you know, it wasn't just, you know, tourists and lumberjacks and it was, you know, there was an ongoing presence. People from Odanak, the Abenakis of Odanak, and people from Akwesasne and Ganawage continued to utilize, to come down and set up camps and sell their wares. Then there were also a lot of people that, you know, came out to work as lumberjacks. Like, for instance, this is not in the book, but one of our elders, Francis Boots, here in Akwesasne, worked with Nadine Jennings, who was, I think she's retired now, but she was a professor at SUNY Canton, I believe. And they captured his account of his father and his grandfather's tales of working as lumberjacks in the Adirondacks during the Great Depression. So he talks about the way of life that evolved around that, of, you know, maybe a group of 3 or 4 men would be a team and they would set out to the Adirondacks. They each would divide the duties of what they would bring. And then they would also, when they had a break, they would make little crafts. They would make like axe handles and stuff. They would carve stuff and bring them home to give as gifts when they came back to their communities. And then the communities also had to compensate for them being gone. So their wives and their families had to divvy up the duties. So it was kind of like a parallel to the iron workers, the way they would go in little groups to different cities and everybody would have to deal with their absence. So he's talking about the Great Depression and how his parents, his father and grandfather, both really, he didn't want to say prospered, but it was enough for their families to survive and to get through all of those hardships. And they had to interact with, you know, it wasn't just them and their gang, but also non-native guys that were also on the same crew. And they would then also help not just cut the trees down, but ride the logs down the river and occasionally fall off them into the water. So he has those great stories about that aspect of Adirondack life, of our guys getting right into it, being a part of that economy while it lasted, because eventually it mechanized and they got rid of a lot of the day-to-day manpower that they had. And so, but he said, at least for that time, our people adjusted to it. They succeeded at it. So that's that kind of stuff that I think gets lost. Because even our own people, we tend towards the fantastical. You know, we gravitate towards those old war stories and, you know, the heyday of colonial warfare and the age of big cuffs. That's what I call it. But then there's the in-between period, the 1800s, which I always tell people was such a critical time for our ancestors, because we went from being these little outposts in the wilderness to suddenly being surrounded by little towns of Irish and everybody. And suddenly our expansive view of our surroundings became very localized, and our way of life kind of had to deal with an in-your-face kind of pressure to change, to adjust, to I don't want to say assimilate, because I really think that's an outdated kind of word. We had to find a way to indigenize ourselves in a new context. And so we did what we had to do. I'm proud of that aspect of ourselves, you know. Today, modern people like to cast their eyes further back to, you know, this mythical 1491 concept. I call it the 180 degree turn to backwards and looking into the past mystically and unrealistically. And I tell people, I said, man, there's no time in our past that our ancestors don't make me proud and envious of them, of the way they rose to challenges. They changed what they needed to, and they kept what they felt they needed to, and they found that balance. And we're the proof of that. Our prosperous communities today are a proof of that spirit of, you know, yes, everything, the world is changing around us. We've got to change with it, but, you know, hold on to that core aspect of our identity and our culture, and we'll be strong that way. We just have to learn to be malleable. And today, the buzzword that people use on us all the time is resilient. And I hate that word. When I hear people say, oh, natives are so resilient, I look that word up, and it seems like it's an industrial word that is more appropriate for foam rubber. If you take foam rubber and press your hands down on it and pull it away, it goes right back to its original shape. And that's what resilience is. It's an industrial kind of term. And I say Native people were not resilient in that way. When this enormous pressure came down upon us, not all of us bounced back in the same shape we were. A lot of us didn't bounce back at all. And we were indelibly changed by that whole experience, that we're not the same. And so I really bristle at when people compliment us with, oh, you're so resilient. Yeah, well, 90% of us didn't survive the first 30 years of European contact, according to archaeologists. So it had a humongous impact on us, still is even to this day. You know, we're still doing that balancing act of what do we take on, what do we maintain. At the same time that we have this cultural resurgence in my community, we have the most Mohawk speakers of any of the other communities. Our language is pretty good shape. But at the same time, we're right in the modern world. Akwesasne has something like 35 cannabis dispensaries open. That's not an advertisement, by the way. I'm just kind of putting that out there as an example of how modern Mohawks aren't, you know, just constantly just thinking about how do we go back to the past. They're right in the modern world, making a living as modern, thoroughly modern people that just have this core of a culture that, you know, we are not done with, and it's still a big part of our lives. So yes, that whole discussion of you know, bringing everyone's perspective into this discussion, that's part of our culture. Our culture has a whole mechanism for getting beyond those hard feelings of past wars, past conflicts, and to cover the bones of the dead with wampum, as they used to say, so that the sight of them doesn't keep us from doing the good work that we're all meant to do. So that's the thing I love about our culture, is that when you really take the time, it gives you so many tools to deal with the changing world, and at the same time maintain that which has always sustained you in the past. So that's why I'm in the business I'm in.
And I just want to thank you so much for that, Darren. And I just, before we turn to audience Q&A, I want to give a plug for Paul's film, Searching for Timbuktu, which Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, is going to air soon on Mountain Lake
Yes.
PBS.
It's actually been airing on WMHT here, and I think at select stations in the North Country. If people do want to view it, you can actually view it online at the WMHT website. You don't have to be a PBS member. I think you have to go to the site and you just search for it. It's there someplace. It might take a little digging.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, let's turn to audience Q&A now. There's some really fantastic questions here. I want to start with this question, which I think is really important. And the audience member asks, how do each of you wrestle with telling stories of Adirondack people who you may or may not share identities with?
Well, I'll start it just because I'm not really a subject matter expert. I'm a storyteller. I find subject matter experts like Amy and Darren who are closer to the topic. So for me, it's about finding the stories that have been untold. The stories that are attracted to are usually stories that are just to the side of wherever the spotlight has been shown before. And so they're kind of in the reflected glow of some previous story, but their story is unknown or little told. That's usually what I gravitate to. And then I find people who are connected to those stories more deeply, more richly, whether they're scholars or people who have identify with the subject.
This is a really pertinent question for me because I just wrote a book exploring the point of view of Black settlers 100-some plus years ago. Very little documentary evidence of their points of view. All of it has to be reconstructed from obscure records that give only a dim idea of what people were thinking. So I have to extrapolate that from legal records, school records, military records, real estate moves and sales and so forth. It's a big jump. I'm not from that world. I'm not Black. I'm not male, as most of the people are I write about. Unfortunately, there's so little about women at all. And I have to simply, to answer your question as bluntly as I know how, I just have to trust my imagination to do its best to step up to the job and hope it sees me through and delivers a credible story that's well documented and not speculative and still keeps you wanting to turn the page. And it's a triple challenge for all those reasons, but I don't know, for some reason, I don't feel very daunted by it. I know this is the age when I ought to, and yet I'm out of step and it's okay. It is what it is.
Yeah, well, for me, I don't know, I find that I tend to dig a pretty deep hole for myself in my work. And I have to kind of pull myself out of it and take a good look around, because it's just the nature of the beast that when you do a deep dive into your own culture and history, although it's a story of interacting with other cultures, I haven't become an expert on France. I haven't become an expert on England, or the Dutch, or even the Abenaki for that matter. I've learned a little bit more, but I kind of have to just kind of take the nod from my ancestors, and what they did is they had a process for interacting and welcoming new people, that they didn't fear it. There was no such thing as xenophobia to them. They knew that it was a built-in part of our culture that we need to keep bringing new blood in. not all tribes were like that. In fact, there's some scholarly discussion about why did so many of the smaller groups in New England, for instance, not do so well in comparison to the Iroquois. What was it about the Iroquoian cultures that allowed us to endure the wave after wave of epidemic disease? And it turns out it's the genetic diversity that is built into our culture. When we would go and after some disaster, we would go out and bring in captives. We'd go on a raiding party to another nation. Could be anybody. There's a whole list of them that we would go out, bring captives in and absorb them and make them part of us. And so that ultimately made our genetic profile stronger and able to sustain the waves of epidemics that came through. Now, maybe not all scholars would agree with that take on the past, but to me, I think our ancestors had that kind of foresight to come up with a culture that was inclusive, that like the adoption ceremony, it basically they would take a person being adopted down to the water and they would wash him. They'd strip him and wash him symbolically of his former identity. And then they would bring him up back to the village and put clothes on him, give him a new name and a new spot in somebody else's in a lodge, and say, you have a new name and a new identity. We're never going to speak of your past identity. You're one of us and we'll defend you to the death. And so that was a pretty cool thing that happened. So contrary to the horror stories that when you were captured by the native people, you didn't, automatically get tortured to death. Most of the time you were incorporated into a culture. And that also relate to nations. Whole villages would sometimes enter into our league and our alliance and end up kind of blending in with us over time. So I think a lot of that is getting lost today, where because we're so we feel like 500 years of that kind of stuff is plenty. And so now we're kind of rolling back a little bit and saying we got to be on guard more. So yeah, it's something that I kind of it's always present in my mind of how much cultures have influenced us. And I see it as clear as day when I study our own legends, the various written accounts of our creation story, the story of the founding of the Confederacy, the Code of Handsome Lake. You can't study those teachings without seeing influence of other nations, other cultures. They're working their way in. Either it's an unconscious thing or a conscious thing. I don't know, but it's undeniable that we weren't just like a solid culture that never changed, never budged. We weren't carved in stone. We were very much a gregarious, outgoing. We want to hear stories as much as we want to tell them. And so that's how we adapted and changed over time. So I don't know, that's just, maybe I'm going a little overboard on that one, but that's just generally the cultural aspect of our people that is open at all times to, learning and studying from other people.
Two questions from our audience members that seem to me very much related. Could the land itself, the biological ecosystem, the various ways humans have interacted with the land be the story that overlies Adirondack history? Related to that, a question from my friends from the Talking Wings storytelling group, Blake and Sinsoon. can we center the history of the Adirondacks through an eco-centric perspective? Is it possible to foreground the voices of the biological ecosystems in a holistic human and non-human history?
That's a fabulous question. I'd love to be at the lecture where a mycologist and a biologist could actually affirm that, because that to me would be a thrilling resolution to this challenge. I think certainly some novels and some books of essays are approaching that, but I haven't seen a systemic take on that from an Adirondack writer yet, and I don't have the expertise to go near it, but it's so beguiling. I wrapped up my book and I just was working on it, so it's on my mind, with an epilogue that counted all the subjects that have arisen in the course of writing it that I didn't have the expertise or the foresight or the brilliance to imagine would be relevant to what I wrote. That would be one of them for sure, but also the story of, this is just along the lines of things we don't have time for in this lifetime, but we want someone to get to them before we die. The story of Peter Smith, Garrett Smith's father, who was the land baron, the land and fur trader, who got the land through duplicitous means from native peoples that he gave his son, that became the patrimony of the black settlers. Now that's a complicated wrinkle that I didn't investigate, but boy, it's a pretty rich story and would recenter my story if I'd thought of it in time or knew enough about it when I started. And this is another one like that. It's another one like that. The story of the indigenous history before everything I wrote about would be part of my story had I known enough to see its role when I started the book, and now it's someone else's turn. But what your questioners suggest is brilliant. Hope it happens. What do you think, Paul?
It's out of my kind of scope. I mean, it's a great question, and like you, I can't wait to see someone do it and tackle it.
Well, I have a question here, I think, Paul, that, I think is, probably really addressed to you especially. What would you point to as some of the readily available tools, methodologies, strategies to bring these more full narratives to the broader public, to make them part of the normal understanding of the region? And it seems to me that storytelling and filmmaking is one of the most accessible pathways for people to be exposed to these different ways of understanding the Adirondack past.
I think that's true, and I think that storytelling and filmmaking are great means. Obviously, I'm biased, but storytelling and filmmaking are finite, right? And so you only have so many pages in the book, so many, so much time allotted for a film, and because of that, you are forced to edit and leave things out and cannot tackle the whole thing. And as Amy said, and I had a professor who once told me, your job is to cover what you can as well as you can, and history is a relay race, and you hope someone picks up where you left off and carries that baton forward. And so, that's where I get, I feel the limitations of what I can do, and I just hope that someone takes and improves upon what I was not able to fully cover. So
I look at resources online as a place where people can go that weren't available 20, 30 years ago, that are, it's a rabbit hole. And if you go down it, you may not get out for years, but really what's now available to a historian, the content rich websites now that can get you right to the day, right to the moment of something that happened 100, 150, 200 years ago, are so deep and so rich and so alluring. If you can just get enough sleep after you get after you've spent 5-6 hours on one of these, and make sure you remember what you read. They can be incredibly interesting. You know, when scholars were writing about what Paul made his movie about, what I wrote about, as recently as 30 years ago, they didn't have accessible archives with its complete inventory of Black newspapers at
Yes.
hand. They didn't have archives.org. They didn't have Northern New York historical newspapers, the website, or newspapers.com. They didn't have Fulton history. All of these have enriched our understanding of social history, and especially the social history of non-elites. And so have the oral histories that have come to light. And so is our understanding of how to use primary texts and documents. So if you can get past and through the veneer of the received Adirondack narrative into these primary worlds, you can really turn up another story that's incredibly luscious with detail and nuance and complication and conflict, and will get you to those meth labs. All you have to do is go onto the blogosphere and you're right there. And that's another way to venture into the world that Adirondack life does not cover. So
I smell another documentary.
yeah, there you go. These resources are there if we look hard.
Well, I'd love to end on such a wonderful call to action for each of us to discover their inner historian and take advantage of these great resources that are just at our fingertips now. So thank you so much to each of our panelists for spending their time, sharing their experiences, sharing their work with us this evening. We so appreciate it. And we so appreciate all of you who showed up to take part in this program. Apologies, we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but they were really fantastic. Thank you so much for those. A quick plug that we will be having another symposium roundtable discussion tomorrow evening at the same time, 7 p.m. And this one is entitled Wilderness for All. And we will be talking with 3 wilderness inclusivity advocates and activists about the work that they've been doing to open up space for people to engage with the Adirondack wilderness, with Adirondack land, water, and mountain landscapes. So thank you all for attending this evening. We hope to see you again tomorrow. And a hearty thanks and my personal gratitude to Amy Godine, to Paul Miller, and Darren Bonaparte for being part of this program this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.